Monster House presents.
It's actually quite unlike anything we've ever seen before.
A giant, hairy creature, part ape, part man.
In Loch Ness, a 24-mile-long bottomless lake in the Highlands of Scotland. It's a creature known as the Loch Ness Monster.
Monster Talk.
Welcome to Monster Talk, the science show about monsters. I'm Blake Smith.
And I'm Karen Stolzno.
We've been doing this show since 2009. That's a long time, but not even close to as long as I've been fascinated by monsters. That got started way earlier. I have a tattered copy of a paperback book from Daniel Cohen titled The Greatest Monsters in the World that I bought at the school book fair. Let's see, its copyright says 1977, so I assume this would have been in the second or third grade. The cover's fallen apart, held on by a piece of tattered gray duct tape. And inside, I've written my name in 3 styles, including a rudimentary cursive, which makes me think it was probably third grade. The point of that is this. When I first got involved in thinking about cryptids, it was in probably the heyday of the field. It was after the coining of the term cryptozoology, and it was after the Patterson-Gimlin film. Another early book that I encountered in the first or second grade was On the Track of Bigfoot by Marion Place. I have a copy of that too. Published in 1974, this green fabric book was one of my gateways into Bigfoot. I'm holding it in my hand right now, and I'm amused to see that in the last chapter, it's talking about a young and enthusiastic Bigfoot researcher named Tom Biscardi. Yeah, that's Tom Biscardi, writing a typo into an early bit of Bigfoot fame. It's not really the author's fault. She's clearly quoting from a newspaper article that I tracked down to a 1973 issue that messes up Biscardi's name, leaving out the D. Now, this amuses me so much. Not the typo, but that right now it's the same ragtag band of misfits, enthusiasts, grifters, and true believers that have been around all this time. The old guard's dying off, but the messy mysteries and the tiny fiefdom feuds continue across Bigfoot hunting groups, while at the same time, the larger story of cryptozoology seems to be blurring into a pop culture potluck. So this buffet of buffoonery includes everything from the sincere amateur scientist to the most gullible gobbler of the fantastic. And somewhere in there is still the cryptozoology core, the people who are looking for real animals in these monster stories. But all around that, there's this frenzy of folklore, fantasy, and confabulation. If you study this stuff long enough, there's a few reliable character arcs that play out. One is the never-give-up, die-hard Bigfoot believer. Now, this doesn't have to be exclusively about Bigfoot believers. I'm using that for alliterative purposes here. Then there's the Bigfoot burnout. This hits a lot of people when they start with an open mind but get tired of the hoaxes and the ambiguity of the evidence and all the infighting. And then there are the paranormal proponents, people who may have started out looking for something normal, but have to account for both the lack of physical evidence and the weird supernatural stories that accompany classic hairy hominid tales. What if it's not just an animal, but something supernatural, or extraterrestrial, or ultra-dimensional, or even demonic? The paranormalist can stomach those elements without a hiccup. And of course, there are the deniers. The it can't be a real animal, so it's made up types. That's not enough, though. Disgusted by the lack of plausibility, they often denigrate the entire field as a pointless waste of time. And sometimes these folks are broad-spectrum cultural dismissers of anything they deem irrational, and that includes religion. Now, I know a lot of these folks, but I think they're missing an important point. Namely, that Bigfoot stories don't care if you believe in them. They don't care if they're implausible. They are stories, and stories are vital to the human experience. I don't mind living in a world where Bigfoot's not real, but I feel richer for living in a world full of Bigfoot stories. But let's get back to cryptozoology as a whole. Is cryptozoology slouching towards bedlam? I'm going to keep exploring this question because it's an evolving one, and seeking lots of voices might help me reach some personal consensus view. Right now, I'm not sure. The pedantic side of me says that if you're not looking for a mundane animal, well, then you're not doing cryptozoology. But the big tent side of me says, let all the stories come in, because this is ultimately a cultural matter and not a cryptid matter. I love monsters, and I love people, and I just want to understand, so I will continue these questions until I stop being curious. Which I hope is coterminous with my own life, because servicing my curiosity is what makes this whole journey worthwhile. This is part 2 of a conversation with paleontologist Darren Naish. We're continuing our Dogman discussion, so be sure to listen to part 1 if you haven't, by talking about these questions of where cryptozoology is headed. I think it's an interesting question, and I appreciate very much Darren's willingness to engage it. We're not even close to being done with this topic, though, so stay tuned for future conversations about what's next for cryptozoology.
Monster Dog.
I first had you on the show back in 2010, episode 21, and my God, it doesn't seem like it was that long ago, but yet it feels like cryptozoology has really changed, and I think this Dogman stuff's a perfect example. It felt like growing up, cryptozoology was about real animals or animals that might be real, and I don't know about your take on it, but it feels like over the past 15 years or so, there's been a lot more portals and weird apports and supernatural stuff and demonic influence. Is that your vibe too? What do you think is going on with cryptozoology?
Yeah. It's a thing I think about a lot, and my get out of jail free card is the fact that I've always said, as long as I've been writing about cryptozoology and publishing on it, I've always said that I feel that my ideas on this are just constantly evolving, constantly changing. When I first became interested academically in the field, and I was very young, I was late teenage years at that point. I was publishing on this stuff when I was as young as 18, which today, oh my God, what a mistake that was. But like many of us, I became interested in cryptozoology because I had read, I hadn't actually read any of the classic books like those by Hoovermans, but I'd read enough stuff to make me think that these claimed creatures are real flesh and blood animals awaiting discovery, became interested in it because really enjoyed the kind of theorizing, and let's look at all these, this vast pool of anecdotes and eyewitness, encounters, and what creatures await discovery. And moving now into kind of like the early 2000s, I'm thinking that if you accept that a large number of flesh and blood animals await discovery, well, wait a minute. The anecdotal support for, let's say, yetis and various kinds of sea monsters and lake monsters, it's not tremendously different. And there's a couple of caveats in here that we'll skip over for now, but it's not tremendously different from a lot of the work that qualified zoologists, naturalists, natural historians do when they go to, some island in the South Pacific. They see some small brown bird, and they come home and say, there's this small brown bird that we've got to find on, imagine a tropical island or whatever, and I obviously, because of the influence of Roy Mackal, Bernard Hoovermans, Carl Schuker, Michael Bright, a list of other authors, this is clearly a branch of zoology. Cryptozoology is the study of animals that await discovery. So I did as much kind of promotion as I could that cryptozoology is a part of zoology. That was the view that I really wanted to promote. I deliberately, I think there's articles I published probably around about 2006, 2007, where I'm saying, that version of Darren Naish is saying that we shouldn't refer to this as monster hunting. We should stop using the term monsters in connection with cryptozoology, because people are looking for animals, and these animals, whatever, name your favorite cryptid, the evidence for it is not that different from the hypothetical small brown bird I mentioned a moment ago. And I wasn't the only one saying that. I was working and co-authoring with other people that were pushing the same thing. Let's scientize cryptozoology. Let's make it, more mainstream. Mm-hmm. Well, today, that doesn't seem like it, but that's actually decades ago now. How's that worked out, Darren? How's that gone for you? Well, it's like it hasn't. That's not what's happened at all. There hasn't been any, movement towards increasing scientific acceptance of cryptozoology. There is nobody that's out there finding and naming, like, air quotes, normal animals, like the hypothetical small brown bird, that are happy to call those animals cryptids or call themselves cryptozoologists. The only people that are doing cryptozoology, who are talking about cryptids, are basically monster hunters. We are talking about the search for monsters. If you are looking for an unknown small lizard or bird, or goby that belongs within a group of recognized species of that sort, that really isn't cryptozoology. That kind of is actually normal zoology. And I have, more than happy with it. I've not kind of, been dragged into this view kicking and screaming, but I am far more accepting of the view today that cryptozoology really is about it's a socio-anthropological study that basically involves elements of folklore that do overlap with natural history and zoology. People are seeing real animals and misinterpreting them, and there may be some new species in there. But yes, it's not standard zoology. And then also, finally, you already touched on this: the fact that a chunk of the stuff that we call cryptozoology very much is not just non-scientific, but is often almost anti-scientific.
Ooh,
the fact that is there, that's now prevalent. A big chunk of the discussion, where people are talking about cryptozoology and monsters and how we should interpret them, is not happening in a world inhabited by natural historians, zoologists, naturalists, herpetologists, ornithologists, etc. Is happening among people who are framing these things as related to a spiritual view of the world, a paranormalist view of the world, basically. And I think in the time that I've been interested in cryptozoology, certainly this century, there has been more of a paranormal creep, more of like an idea that, we haven't found compelling scientific evidence for Bigfoot. Well, maybe that's because it's not within this realm. Maybe it's, you've heard all these kind of explanations that have been put forward that
it is funny though, because if you accept that they might be real, like real creatures, but they never leave evidence, or the kind that you could reproduce or use to track down an individual specimen, you're really kind of faced with a couple of options, and one of them would be, they are actually a cultural or psychological phenomenon, not a physical one. But the other flip side of that is they are supernatural or advanced technology, way beyond our ken, and neither of those are particularly provable, but one of those falls within a more naturalistic explanation.
Yeah.
So I kind of find myself landing on the cultural hypothesis and the psychological, but also it's not really safe to say that there is a single explanation, because it's not a single kind of story. And it's like, I don't ever want to push anybody to saying, what's your explanation for Bigfoot? Because it's a million things,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I very, very much agree. And that's why I always feel like my views when I'm asked about the subject meander all over the place, because I just don't feel like it's tidily, you can't tidily pigeonhole this field into... Yeah, and the effort that I was talking about from the early 2000s by myself to try and make cryptozoology part of zoology, I always knew that wasn't right, because obviously there's this massive folkloric cultural component to it for certain mystery creatures. And today it's obvious that I think that is a larger part of it. It's a cultural field, a socio-anthropological one, yet it's not fair to say that it doesn't include zoology and natural history, because those are involved in it. My views, most recently been put together for an article I wrote in Biologist magazine, published 2022. Pretty good to get, quite a big deal to get an article on cryptozoology into that magazine. It's called a cultural phenomenon, I think, the title of the article. But yeah, that it does push that. It pushes that.
Spoiler,
that
but shouldn't you pose that a question to get people to click on it?
Maybe it's 2022. It feels like old hat now. Anyone that would have read it already has. But I wouldn't. Yeah, it still does have. There is still a zoological component in at least some parts of it, and I, obviously there are still creatures of interest to cryptozoologists that are, investigation and discussion of them is more about normal zoology.
Yeah.
Than is the case for phenomena like Dogman.
Well, you've got alien big cats, and that's just a load of fun. And those you can sometimes you can get DNA. I don't know. I'm a little concerned about where it's collected, et cetera. But I mean, it's still it's not biologically implausible that there's big cats in the UK, which is very, very interesting.
Yeah, that's a good example of a mix and match. I mean, I think there's a valid biological / zoological phenomenon there, but there is also a cultural element at play, which is fascinating and again understudied. There's actually you could write again. You could do a whole proper study on this. There's views in parts of Europe, including the UK, that panthers are kind of a part of the landscape, kind of in a sort of like weird conspiratorial sense, because rich people are supposed to have owned them and deliberately released them to terrorize peasants. That's kind of an idea that goes back hundreds of years, and it's sort of carried through to modern times, because today I think this was studied in France. There were actually groups of farmers up in arms because of. Are you aware of the rewilding movement?
I am. I recently became aware of this. Yeah, I was.
Right.
We were covering it on in research of, because there was an episode about wild children, and they talked to a Scotsman who was trying to. He was rescuing wolves, but there was also like modern Scottish rewilding of wolves movement. I looked. Yeah. Yes, I am.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So some people, like people that work on the land, farmers and whatnot, don't want lynxes and wolves and wild boar and moose and so on to be reintroduced to places like France and the UK. And there is, I'm not saying this is like everyone interested endorses this, but there is the idea that the reason that we've got panthers back here killing our sheep is because wealthy ecologists are deliberately releasing foreign animals into the landscape, and that's making our life harder. So even whether there are real panthers, whatever they are, leopards, lynxes, whatever, even if you do have that as a valid phenomenon, and again, as a biological phenomenon, even if you've got that, you've still got this socio-cultural phenomenon operating in the minds of all the people.
It's interesting.
Without,
In the U.S., the big one, the frequently encountered conspiracy is they're here. The mountain lions in unusual places, I guess, would be our thing. And the argument is that they exist, but that the state or the federal game regulatory agencies don't want to scare people, so they deny their existence.
Right.
So. Again, always you just need a corpse to sort of disprove that. But I guess one thing about cryptozoology is I've always wanted it to be more of a science. And I thought if, people think they're amateur scientists when they're going out to look, as opposed to monster hunters, it's a different take. And you would want them to have some basic scientific training. How do you collect a sample? How do you let people know when and where it happened? And I've always had this sort of dream, I say always, at least since I've been doing this show, that there would be some way to do sort of a DNA survey of the Pacific Northwest. That if you're going to go out and look for Bigfoot, also take samples, also note where you got them, and put that in. Now because of eDNA, that could actually happen. But that's not at all what we see in Bigfoot culture. What we see is something different. I call it LARP camping, but it's basically people going out in the woods with thermal cameras, banging sticks, making Bigfoot howls. And if you hear a Bigfoot howl and you hear a wood knock, how do you know that's a Bigfoot and not more campers? I don't know. It's very very confusing.
I'm with you on that. And I mean, if you go to Bigfoot conferences and such at the moment, eDNA is today. It's, for those who don't know, environmental DNA, DNA collected from the environment, including even from the air, not just from the soil and water. But
wow,
yeah, it's one of the most popular. Yes, it's the new buzzword. Everyone's talking about it. So yeah, kind of two parallel things. The people who do have the know-how, the tech, the smarts to go and collect data and know how to study and publish it, are for the most part so busy with other stuff that that's just not on their agenda. If you are an ecologist studying, you name it, the ecology of sequoia trees in California, you're working pretty flipping hard to get that work done. There is no money in science. It's very hard to make a living in science. And
how did they afford to build all them ivory towers then? Tell me that.
You get those for free when you enroll. It's the upkeep that's the expensive thing, especially what with certain recent political events in the United States that have happened over the past several years. It can be hard to make a living in science. So I think if you are scientifically qualified, if you are invested in a certain, involved in a certain field, then yeah, you are not going to be able to make the time to hey, let's for fun, let's just collect some samples and see if we've got some primate DNA or alien panther DNA or whatnot. So you've got that as one strand of what I'm describing here. The second thing is you do have a large number of really interested and often dedicated amateurs who are going out into the wild and hoping to look for Bigfoot and other cryptids, and as you said, a lot of this does look like LARPing. It really does. Many of them are doing the right things that they should in order to behave as citizen scientists, as amateur scientists. And if you listen to enough people in, certainly the Bigfoot community, they're obviously the most visual here. Cliff and Bobo mention this quite a lot of times on their podcast. People are encouraged to collect samples and to think about things in a scientific way, to think about constructing and testing hypotheses. The problem is that although I think that the amateur, the citizen scientist is now aware of this more than ever, there still isn't enough expertise on their part to know what to actually do with data once you get it. And by the way, I'm not saying that it's a problem that they don't get valid evidence of the existence of. I don't want to keep talking about Bigfoot, but they don't get valid evidence for it. The fact that there is evidence of any kind, even negative evidence, is still kind of a result of a sort, and potentially still something publishable. What I've discovered is that these people don't know how you actually get things into the canon of science, how things actually become scientific. I've now done field work with quite a few people really interested in behaving as citizen scientists. They might have a very biased approach. They might be true believers when it comes to the cryptids concerned, but they do want to kind of do things like by the book. But they don't know how to actually get things, involved in the process of science. You don't publish things in popular magazines and blogs and that's the end of it. You do have to try and get stuff into the technical literature. For working scientists, that is tremendously hard. I mean, actually getting stuff finally published is really hard, even if you know what you're doing. So I don't have an end point to where I'm going with this, but I'm saying there's these two parallel things. There's the people who know how to do it. It's really hard, but they're not going to be spending their time on the cryptozoology stuff. And there's the people who are spending their time on the cryptozoology stuff, but aren't matching up with the qualified scientists to have a result that is viewable to humanity as a whole.
I guess I've always thought, or I have long thought, that if those two groups could somehow work together at all, even if you don't find a Bigfoot, you might find some really interesting biological data, and I think that would be awesome. Would it be worth the investment in time? I don't know. Maybe not, but maybe. I don't know. It depends what you find. I mean, you would probably get a lot of really interesting information about the sort of genetic population of areas that have gone relatively unstudied, and that's certainly valuable in the big data sort of sense.
I think part of the reason this is really hard to match those two areas up is because of like basically how careers work.
Yeah.
When can you, as a working person, take time out of your life and go and spend, like a month in the Rocky Mountains or in Central Asia or whatever, like looking for stuff with pro cryptozoology people? Most of us just can't do that, and the number of people that can do that or can do it in some form are really few and far between. You're talking about a tiny number of people worldwide. So I went to Tajikistan last year with I'm sure they won't mind me saying this, but true believer cryptozoology people with Richard Freeman and among others, and we collected a whole bunch of interesting information. I'm not sure what way it goes. I don't want to talk about all the results here because we do still aim to publish it. But we collected anecdotal information, which to me felt a bit more folklory and a bit more like ethnographic than biological. But nevertheless, it was data from interesting areas relevant to the belief in the cryptids concerned, an Almas type, wild man type creature, and claimed late surviving Caspian tigers. We did collect information, and my aim as someone who publishes fairly regularly in the technical literature is to get it written up and published. But here we come back to what I was saying a minute ago about when people do this in their lives. I've had this data since last year, and I haven't yet had time to finish the paper because the way my life works, I just don't have time to sit down and write papers on something that's really extraneous to everything else I do.
Totally understand. Yeah. It takes me, sadly, years to get I have an idea, and then it takes me 5 to 10 years to get it done. And then when it's done, it feels like, oh, that didn't take long, but it did. It took a long time.
It's a big chunk of your life, exactly.
It really is. Well, you mentioned Freeman, and it reminds me of the British Forteans. Are you still in touch with sort of the Fortean culture over there? Or I've been wondering if I'm a big fan of like Fortean Times, but it feels like those are all people my age and older. Are young people becoming Forteans? What's the demographic? What's the culture like these days in the UK?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I mean, on the first thing to say is, yes, I am still in touch with a lot of those people, talk to them fairly regularly, talk to quite a few of the people who are involved in putting together Fortean Times. I'm still in touch with, I am regularly in touch with quite a few people that are, in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, fairly well known for their interest in cryptozoology. The fact that we no longer have, a really important part of maintaining a community of like-minded people is, you need to have the opportunity to meet up. It's tremendously difficult to actually just go and, travel halfway across the country, just go and hang out with someone. We no longer have Unconvention, the Fortean Times meeting. That died some years ago, which was a real shame because that was a real hub. And John Downes of the Centre for Fortean Zoology used to run an event called Weird Weekend, and that no longer happens due to, where John is in his own life. I talk to John quite regularly. There is an event called Weird Weekend North, but the UK is tiny, but it's incredibly expensive to move around here.
So I've heard. I didn't realize the trains were so expensive and apparently also unreliable. So this was all news to me.
Oh yeah. It's like I don't drive, and I don't want to rely on my wife to take me everywhere. But a trip of like 200 miles for us is. You wouldn't want to pay to travel by public transport, the incredibly unreliable public transport. So we don't have a regular sort of monster-themed, cryptozoology-themed meeting, which is a problem. In terms of young people, that's a really interesting question as well, because the people we interact with, our vision of what a community is like is sort of dependent on where we are ourselves in life. And I'm in my 40s. Most people I know are sort of similar age to me. I don't hang out with like teenagers and 20-year-olds, but I am not aware of that many young people that are kind of coming into this. I do see quite a few people on social media who are young and who are quite interested in the history of flesh and blood cryptozoology. A few of them have even published things in it. So actually, the more I think about this, I think that there are, at least some people getting into this.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I know we have a lot of young listeners on Monster Talk, so I always want to encourage people, to be interested in these things. And I just like them to use some critical thinking about, how to approach it. But these are the stories that have entertained me my entire life. So
yeah,
I don't want them to die out, but I also kind of don't want them to turn into weird supernatural stuff. I still,
Well, I think like the impression I get is that we, among the younger people I'm thinking of, I've got a whole list in mind. Actually, the more I think about it, I don't want to say their names. I'm going to get them wrong. But they really are living in post-cryptid cryptozoology. They really are living within that space and talking about, this discussion of monsters cryptozoology today goes hand in hand with speculative evolutions, an interest in imaginary aliens and science fiction, knowledge of the animals of the past. I think it's seen that, hey, wow, there was. You could be there's many people that are interested in paleontology and the history of thought on evolution, and say that, wow, there was a time in the 1930s where people had this particular model for human evolution, say, and it's not that different from that. That's a completely respectable thing that could be discussed in any anthropological technical journal. You could talk about that, and at the same time you can say there was a time in the 1950s when people honestly did, Bernard Hooverman's hypotheses were always couched in his big picture evolutionary scenarios. Like the Yeti's not just a mystery primate; it's a specific kind of mystery primate that tells you something about the evolution of primates. And there's a bunch of whole processes that have led to it being the way that it is. The people I'm thinking of are living within that space. So the TET ZooCon, Tetrapod Zoology Convention event that I run. We've got the next one coming up at the end of September this year in London, Bush House in London. I aim for probably next year's meeting to be more monster cryptozoology focused, and I'm hoping there to get a whole bunch of people that work on monsters, the science of monsters, to give talks. And the people I'm thinking of, the number of people researching this, you could have like a pretty good number of speakers on such an sort of subject. Yeah,
that would be awesome.
I'll keep you posted.
Please do, and I'll put links to your article about Dogman and links to your TED ZooCon all in the show notes, so listeners can check that out. Darren, I love talking to you. I know we don't get to talk much, but I always feel like we're close, and it's really funny because between listening to your podcast, which I hope you get to come back to someday, and other things. I know we have so much in common, so I hope someday we get to meet in person.
Back at you, man. Yeah, I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you very much for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Monster Talk.
You've been listening to Monster Talk, the science show about monsters. I'm Blake Smith.
And I'm Karen Stolzno.
You just heard part 2 of my interview with Darren Naish. We started out in part 1 discussing the history of Dogman, and here in part 2 we were discussing the current state of cryptozoology. What's next for the field? Who can say? But I hope to be here to talk about it, and I sure hope you'll be here too. Monster Talk's theme music is by Peach Stealing Monkeys. If you're hearing this, then you got through our service chain successfully and are getting episodes via the new feed. And if you're not hearing this, then who was phone?
This has been a Monster House presentation.